to thank everybody at the various institutions that co-sponsored this. I won't rename them all, and especially want to thank all of you for being here. Although obviously I wish it could be in person. So my charge tonight is to talk about the founding era struggle for public schools and informed citizenship, and I think it's just a good place to start is what do I mean? And I think the idea that education is essential to democracy seems obvious, perhaps even a cliche, but what we all probably recognize is that this is often under attack. Anti-intellectualism runs rampant in American life. Attacks, funding cuts to the very institutions, namely public schools, that we know best create informed citizenship are often on the table. And so my message tonight is that even if we think of the centrality of education to a democracy to be a cliche, it's one we can't take for granted. It's one we have to fight for. And it's one that we have fought for, or some people have fought for, I should say, from the founding era on. And I think the founding era is the place to start when we're thinking about this topic, because the idea that education is necessary in American public life is a cliche, if it is a cliche. It is because of the American Revolution that it is one. And sometimes we might forget that. But I think the fact that we can find a usable past in the revolutionary era to make arguments for why schools, and particularly public schools, are important to inform citizenship are helpful in our present moment. They matter. They help us make good arguments now for why we should invest in these values. And the place to start is sort of what this cliche is reacting against and perhaps leaving behind. And that is that in the American Revolution, American colonists, come Americans, overthrow a monarchy. And in a monarchy, people were subjects, right? Subjects of a sovereign king, and it didn't much matter. In fact, it could be kind of useful if they were uneducated, if they were ignorant. And the revolution changes all of that by creating a republic founded on at least one of the basic ideas of which was that the people were sovereign. And though we would elect officials, those officials were there to enact the will of the people. And so if the people were to make their will known, they had to know how to do that. And it's not always an easy thing to do. So the idea becomes that, in fact, people need to learn how to make their will known, how to be well informed, what it meant to be an informed citizen, capable of expressing their ideas and actualizing their wishes. And this basic shift in a kind of government and governing philosophy is what lends a lot of weight to the idea that government should create schools that can teach people the skills necessary for self-government. For me, the person who summed this up best was Noah Webster, who you all know for dictionary reasons. But Webster was interested in education reform in the early republic. And in 1787, he wrote a pamphlet in which he argued that a system of education that essentially gave every citizen the requisite knowledge and skills to both exercise citizenship and potentially hold office too was not only desirable, but was, as he put it, the sine qua non of the existence of the American republics. And for such a kind of system of education to exist, it had to be public, right? Since power was in the hands of the people, he wrote, knowledge should be universally diffused by means of public schools. And what he had in mind at the were at the time known as common schools. I'm going to ask you to keep two terms in your head through the 25 or so minutes that I'm going to take up. But term one to remember is common schools. What we would think of as public elementary education, right? The 3 R's. And that would be tax supported and broadly accessible. And this was a somewhat novel idea. The model that people like Webster point to are town schools in New England. New England had town schools since the 17th century, tax-supported schools, basically there to teach students to read so that they could read the Bible. But the idea here is to expand this form of education, accessible, tax-supported schools for ordinary people, to everyone, to teach the rudiments of citizenship. And you see this idea popping up all across the early republic. Thomas Jefferson famously proposes a plan for public schooling. George Washington is on record saying common education is important. There are various state constitutions that have provisions that vaguely provide for public support for schools. I think most importantly, perhaps the Northwest Ordinance, which governs how the old Northwest, which became the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, I think, how those places would become states, but it also provided that public education would be forever encouraged in these places. So this civic need for education coming out of the revolution is the foundational argument for public schooling in the United States. But saying education is important and that we should devote some public funds to it doesn't itself create an informed citizenry that can capably self-govern. And so some of the people I've mentioned don't follow through on their calls for public schooling. Some of the state constitutions take really long time to realize the promise inherent in them. Even education in the old Northwest, where land was put aside to fund public education, was not always up to what people had in mind. But I want to focus in on Webster's diagnosis for what went wrong. Why? So he makes this call for public schooling, but he does it in the context of complaining that the state governments in particular were not creating the common schools he wanted to see. Instead, they were supporting, and here comes term number 2 that I'd like you to keep in your head. The state was supporting academies, where he noted people of property may educate their sons. So academies is the second kind of term for the day. Academies were privately run schools. Often they had received state sanction to exist in the form of a corporate charter, and often too sometimes state support in the form of land grants or lotteries, and sometimes direct cash. And they offered a traditional sort of education. Most taught the classics, Latin and Greek, and a combination of what was known at the time as polite or ornamental subjects. Things like the French language, dancing, visual arts, oratory. And Webster was right on that these were spreading in the period that he was hoping to see common schools spread. There were about 175 or so founded in the first 20 years of the Republic in the first 14 states. But another way of looking at this that I kind of like is that if you drive around to enough small towns in the United States, you start seeing academy streets everywhere. And that is a relic of their sort of once prominent place. And so this is just a Washington Post reporter put this together 5 years ago, list of the most common road names in the United States. And you can see that academy, there's not a huge number of them. There's many more school streets, but there's a fair number of academy streets. And so it's just a kind of testament, I think, to how prominent and widespread this kind of institution once was. In fact, the other day I drove to get a cup of coffee and I parked in a parking lot on Academy Street. So it hits me every once in a while. But the problem with academies, Webster argued, was that in them, no provision is made for instructing the poorer rank of people, right? The schools essentially drew the children of well-to-do families who could afford to pay for tuition, room, and board, which was all very expensive. And so this fact that Webster saw state governments not only allowing academies to spread, but investing in them instead of common schools led him to conclude that in the United States, the constitutions are Republican, but the laws of education were monarchical, right? And so if education was supposed to be the foundation of the Republic, the forms of education should have been Republican. And this quotation is where I take the title from my book. Nobody could pronounce monarchical. I learned the hard way. And so aristocratic it was. But aristocratic also sort of fits the bill better in many ways. Webster's critique was ultimately that Americans were investing in education, but only education for an elite, which was sort of how they did things in Europe and how European aristocrats got educated. And so what the United States was doing in founding all these academies was kind of creating its own form of aristocracy, but one grounded in education as opposed to sort of hereditary. So my task in the book was to explain why so many academies were built at this moment when the importance of universal education was first becoming a cliche. And what I found, as we'll see sort of towards the end of the presentation part at least, is that the reaction to the proliferation of academies is part of what crystallized the argument, not just for public education, but for the kind of principles that need to underlie a public education system that can actually create an informed citizenry that sustained democracy. So to the first question, why were there so many academies? And the short answer is simply that some Americans prioritized building these kinds of schools. Federalists in particular, Federalists were the political coalition that supported the ratification of the Constitution, and then during the 1790s, under the leadership of men like Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, pushed for a stronger central government. And as the conventional story goes, they were motivated by a belief that in the 1780s, the United States was falling quickly into crisis. It was partly because the Articles of Confederation were too weak, but it was also because, they argued, too much power was left to the states. And in the states, the wrong kind of men held power. Short-sighted, ignorant men, they would say, men of lesser means than themselves. And so for the new nation to function, they thought not only did you need a more powerful central government, but one with well-educated men at the helm. So just some examples taken from some New York writers. Americanists writing in August of 1787 argued that as the convention was meeting in Philadelphia, that whatever they came up with would not be sufficient unless they also found a way to displace from the helm characters who carry every mark of civil inferiority and cannot enjoy the confidence and esteem which the world always gives to property and education. Another writer wrote that Federalists and the supporters of the Constitution wished for a government administered by the better sort of people who have had something of a liberal education. So you can see here that they're melding this call for education with also a call for rule by a kind of traditional elite group, right? There's a lot of melding of wealth and learning in this rhetoric. In other words, though, what the Federalists are arguing is that the main issue here is not fixing the citizenry, but fixing the leadership class. And so they wanted to find a way to make Americans defer to their kind of betters, to people they believe should rightly lead. And so one way they did this was not just supporting academies that trained students who would grow up to be leaders in this mold, but they would trot these students out at public events. Things like July 4th celebrations or processions in support of the Constitution that were happening in 1787 and 1788. And the idea was to put these students front and center, show what they could do. They would give orations and things like that, with the idea of convincing the general public that these people deserved to be in power, right? That they earned it. And the phrase that was often used at the time was that academies produced a natural aristocracy of merit. That sounds kind of modern, right? They're saying instead of being ruled by a hereditary group of wealthy people, we should be ruled by sort of meritocrats. The fact remains, though, that even if you think that's a good thing, if you take Webster at his word, there was nothing meritocratic about this, right? What they were doing was taking the children of well-to-do parents who could afford to send their kids to get an advanced classical education in a private school in a state, usually with no public elementary schools, were then being touted as the community's future leaders because of their education. When in practice, what this meant was essentially that they were kind of laundering the privilege of these children. And critics attack academies on a few fronts that help build the argument for reform. One of the arguments comes from sort of a more political argument, not directed necessarily at schools, but against kind of the Federalists' sociology of how American governance should work. People like, to stick with New York, which I'm going to try to do throughout, to stick with New York, Melancton Smith, who's an anti-Federalist in New York turned Republican, who believed that not only should the leaders in the United States represent people, but they should actually be representative of the people. In other words, if you had a society that was, 65% commercial farmers, then they should be represented 65% by, commercial rural farmers. And to make that vision possible required empowering anyone in that community, at least any white man, to be capable of representing his fellow citizens. And so that meant you needed education that trained up all of these people. Right, targeting education to people that traditionally you assumed would hold power did nothing to create this new form of representative government that people like Smith wanted. And when this criticism turns towards the academies, the point that that critics make is that all of the state funding that was going to academies stood in the way of creating the kind of schools that would actually empower a well-informed citizenry capable of governing itself. To take an early example, actually before Melanchthon Smith, I just really like these essays from 1784 in the Boston Magazine. It's a series of 2 essays that intended to show the destructive consequences and tendency of establishing private academies in this government. Every time he writes private academies, it's all caps. The author's point was that if there were no such thing as a private academy, wealthy parents, middle-class parents would work in their own town to establish a good school in which the youth would all have it in their power to receive an advantage, right? That would create the kind of schools that could sustain Republican self-government, but allowing elite parents to have their children educated separately just undercut this kind of solidarity, communal togetherness that was required to create these sort of common schools that were legitimately common. The essayist concludes by warning that if Massachusetts didn't change its tune and stop founding academies and ignoring common schools, that the government would be subverted from a republic to an aristocracy. If schools created essentially a narrow elite, it would produce a country governed by one. And so the trope that's building that I want to kind of synthesize these critiques together for a second, the trope that's building is that academies, that really private education undermined common public education and in turn, Republican self-government, democracy itself. Those arguments pick up a head of steam in the 1790s. In particular, just to throw a little bit of flair from the day into this talk, some of my favorite commentary on this comes from the diary of William Bentley, who is a Unitarian minister from Salem, Massachusetts, who notes at one point that academies are too numerous and that their model is not purely Republican. But my favorite example is he has a friend who writes to him, and this letter is preserved in his papers, which are published. Friend goes to Exeter, New Hampshire, and sees the Phillips Exeter Academy building, the very stately academy building, sitting next to the modest local town school. And he writes to Bentley that this seems to preach this layout. While the academy towers over the common school, the doctrine so much believed that academies destroy town schools. So it's one of these in the way that I started with a trope of democracy needing education. There's a trope that academies are sort of a problem in certain circles. And increasingly by the 1790s, that argument takes on a kind of partisan flavor. And so to see how this played out more broadly, I just want to zero in on New York. For a few reasons. The main one is that in theory, we're in New York, although we couldn't be together, but also because New York had one of the most advanced academy systems of the day. These are just 2 examples of academies in Westchester, where you all are. The one with the cars in front, I couldn't find a better picture, is now the Bedford Free Library in Bedford, but that building was built as the Bedford Academy in the early 1800s, and John Jay was on the board. The more picturesque one without the cars out in front is I think the North Salem Town Office building these days, but it was built in the late 1780s as the North Salem Academy. It wasn't actually just that New York built some stately academies, but actually they made a whole bureaucracy to do this. Others of you may have suffered under the wrath of the New York State Regents exam system. You might not know that the Board of Regents was founded in the 1780s, first to govern Columbia University, and by 1787 its primary task really became overseeing, chartering, and regulating all the academies in New York State. The board was pretty much entirely run by Federalists, and through it, the Federalists were able to invest state funds in these schools that they thought were so necessary. From 1792 to 1797, for example, the state regents were given £1,500 per year to spend on the state's 12 academies that collectively served only a few hundred kids. That number probably means nothing to you. £1,500 would have been not quite enough to build one of these buildings, but not far off. But the more important point is that considering the state couldn't be bothered to invest money in anybody else's kids, the fact that they were throwing all of this money at and to subsidize schools built by an elite to educate their children was kind of a big deal. And so by the mid 1790s, this becomes a political issue in New York. In his annual address in 1795, the governor, George Clinton, criticized academies because they were principally confined to the children of the opulent, and a great portion of the population, of the community, excuse me, is excluded. And so he called for the establishment of common schools throughout the state. And they followed through, actually, for a little while. From 1795 to 1800, New York appropriated £20,000 a year for common public schools to get maybe some off the ground and to help struggling schools that local communities were building on their own. It was meaningful, to be sure, but per pupil, this worked out, and per school, what common schools were getting worked out to about 10 or 20% of what, again, per school or per pupil, what the academies were getting, right? So poorer kids were, and ordinary, just sort of non-elite kids were getting 10 to 20% of the state support that rich kids were getting. And then in 1800, the state didn't renew the funding. Enter Jedediah Peck. Peck is a character of the highest order. If you want to read more about him, Alan Taylor's Pulitzer Prize winning book, William Cooperstown, deals with him quite a bit. But Peck was born in Connecticut in the late 1740s, and like many New England men of his generation, end up settling in central New York. So again, he's in Cooperstown. And Peck was hell-bent on, as he wrote, bringing improvement within the reach and power of the humblest citizen. He thought common schools were essential, not academies, because he believed that in all countries where education is confined to a few people, we always find arbitrary government and abject slavery. Peck's commitment to widespread education, public education at the time isn't, it's not that original. I'm saying that this argument was sort of a cliche, but in particular, at this time in the mid to late 1790s, it's radical groups that people affiliated with Thomas Paine in particular, that are groups that are getting criticized by Federalists the way Paine gets criticized, for being enthralled to the French Revolution, for being radical, Jacobinical groups like the Democratic Republican societies that are making similar calls to Peck's. They want the establishment of public schools because they thought they would be the best means of impressing every class of citizens in the community with a true sense of their rights and obligations. What Peck is doing is taking this idea that could seem really radical, that the need for education and democracy might have been a cliche, but actually pushing for genuine common public schooling required redistributive taxation, and that could put people off. What Peck did, and where he succeeded where others might have failed, is that he made this a mainstream political issue in New York State by the 1800s. In the 1807 New York State gubernatorial and assembly elections, for example, Peck's position had essentially become not just the Jeffersonian Republicans in New York's position, but also sort of the thing they were running on. State-funded public education as opposed to academies became a really important campaign issue. One Republican essayist put it in really stark terms, and I'm going to just quote at length here: "Ignorance and slavery afford the richest soil for rearing federal plants," so Federalists, "while republicanism is the spontaneous production of education and independence." So those who wish for a destruction of the school fund, which would have funded common schools, and the advancement of Tories to office, those people should vote for the federal ticket. But if you wished your children educated, rally around the Republican standard. And by 1812, this was a winning message. That year, the state legislature adopted a report on how to create a common school system in the state of New York. And if you're seeing the screen, what you'll notice is the commissioners charged with writing this report. Number one on the list is Jedediah Peck. And he's shameless about it. He quotes himself in the report. The expedient devised by the legislature, the report reads, is the establishment of common schools spread throughout the state and aided by its bounty will bring improvement within the reach and power of the humblest citizen, right? This is literally, he's quoting a newspaper op-ed he wrote, 13 years earlier. And they also go after academies in this report. Academies, understood in contradistinction to common schools, are partial in their operation, circumscribed in their effects. That's that old argument that they don't reach everyone. But common schools under the direction and patronage of the state could. And so New York passed in 1812 a bill for tax-supported, democratically controlled schools, governed by the people, that would create the possibility for self-government more broadly, they hoped. In 1814, they actually made it mandatory for towns to adopt these schools. To conclude, this is a really overly simplistic version of the story that I've given you, a kind of, from an exclusive education focused on catering to an elite to an accessible education aimed at people regardless of class. This is complicated. It does not happen perhaps as neatly in other places as it does in New York. And that is even if I don't think I would even say it happens quite as neatly as I've laid it out here for you in New York. Because people realize there's a lot left to be done. For one thing, the regents keep on founding academies. The common school system creates a new bureaucracy for common schools, but it doesn't really completely undercut the regents. And so New Yorkers like Peck and others recognize the need for secondary and higher education, right? You need schools to train teachers. You need schools to offer more advanced, history, which might be civically useful, or scientific subjects, like in agricultural sciences, for example. And they realize that at the time, the best bet for this is to sort of use academies, but reform them. And so that's a movement from the 1820s to the 1840s to kind of fix academies to better serve the needs of ordinary New Yorkers. Eventually, they just turned to high schools, which are a publicly funded and run version of the level of education that academies were understood to offer. This happens through an act that I would not mention unless I was talking to people in New York State, but the Union Free Schools Act, which is passed in 1853. It allows common school districts to create high schools. It's why a lot of districts in Westchester and nearby are technically Union Free school districts. So in any event, the other way this is complicated is that it doesn't benefit everyone equally. Not coincidentally, I argue, the expansion of access for white men to common schools coincides, again, not a coincidence, with the expansion of voting rights for most white men. But at the same time, this benefit of common schools, in some cases, it aided free Black Northerners. It sometimes benefited women, but when it did, it was inadvertent. In fact, sometimes the early changes in public schooling had no effect on these populations. And in other cases, the successful extension of common schooling to most white men and the privileges they thought it garnered them, perhaps in terms of voting rights, citizenship, and just being educated, led them to jealously guard this privilege, to oppose, in many cases, education for African Americans in the North, or to push at least for segregated schools. And so the concluding thought I want to leave you with is that education had become, by the 1820s or so, the contested terrain for inclusion in civic life, at least in the North. The fight over access to schools, what kind of schools a society should support, how they were governed and funded, was itself a fight over the nature of democracy, for better and for worse. This lingers, right? Ask yourself, if you know you're a historically informed audience, right? Why literacy tests and education tests became the preferred means of disenfranchising African Americans in the Jim Crow South? Why the civil rights movement begins its attack on segregations with a case about schools, Brown versus Board of Education? It's because questions of who gets access to public schools are questions about who counts as citizens, who is part of the body politic. And what my book aims to explain, I think, ultimately is how that equation came to be. So that's my scripted portion of the show. I hope you stayed with me. Like when I'm teaching, I'm talking kind of to a wall these days, but I'm looking forward to the conversation. I think Michael's got some questions for me, and then we're going to open it up. But anyway, thanks so much for being here again, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Mark. And yes, I have some questions for you, but I want to say thanks so much for your presentation, Mike. And I know everybody at home who are attendees are doing the same. So just to lay out the next 50 minutes for everybody, or I suppose 52 minutes, I'm going to ask Mark a couple of questions, but our priority here is really to leave time for attendees to ask questions. So I'm going to ask Mark 2 or 3 questions, and while I'm asking them and Mark's responding to them, just for everybody who's an attendee, you're welcome, and some folks already have, to type in questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You're also welcome to raise your hand, and there's a raise hand button, and I can allow you to talk so that we can hear your voice. So if you think about questions as Mark's answering my questions, then we encourage you to do either of those things. So Mark, my first question, and I think it's more a question that I think many of us were thinking, and then I want to ask you to expand upon. This is the easy one, by the way. Can you talk a little bit more about the gendered aspect of this aristocratic education? And this corresponds to a question that's already been in the Q&A. Thank you, Judith Clark, for asking the question, but I think many of us are just curious to know about the ways in which that girls and women were incorporated, or I think more appropriately not incorporated into these schemes for especially academy education.
Yeah, so this is that's a great question. This is also the age of the rise of female academies, right? And so schools specifically designed to cater to women. And the idea behind these often began, at least, as a kind of sort of conservative, I would, for lack of a better term, conservative model. That is to say that they were there to train women to be kind of Republican mothers or wives or sisters, which meant that their sort of role they would be educated so they could help their family be good citizens and the like. There are some women do attend sort of academies that are not strictly for women. When they do, they often get a pretty advanced run of the curriculum. Usually they don't take the classics, but underneath that, they get a pretty similar level of education. But again, it's a certain class of women who are getting access to this education. Over time, it becomes kind of, the results become kind of progressive. The women who receive these academy educations do a lot with it in pushing for various reforms in American life, whether it's temperance, anti-slavery, eventually women's rights. But I think in the short term, in the period I'm talking about, it kind of sustains this idea that class is sort of particularly important, that education serves to kind of prop up a ruling class, and that educated women are kind of part of that group. And then, as I think I mentioned at the end, when it comes to the attack on academies and the rise of common schools, that does in many cases open things up for girls who are not from well-to-do families. Often this is because states and communities are cheap, and actually offering what are called women's schools, which happen only part of the year, are actually cheaper because you can pay a woman to be the teacher, and so on and so forth. But they're part of the story but ultimately what I would say is that the way the academies are structured is, again, aimed at solidifying a certain kind of social order that is very much class-based, that is in which these particular men rule, and that the educated women are kind of there to sort of help prop it up, to put it kind of crudely.
Thank you. And actually, a follow-up. What about people of color, free, or I suppose less commonly enslaved people? And so this is obviously a regional question, and so much of your book actually while it deals with the continent level and then the national level, the many divergences between the different sections of the country are important, and maybe that will be something that we could talk about moving forward. But what about, I guess, men of color or boys of color, just to follow up on the answer that you gave about women?
Generally, free people of color don't have access to academies mostly. Some academies have some sort of scholarship program that would help get a few less well-to-do, usually white children, boys into the school. But the reality is that, right, if you're thinking about kind of the end of slavery and the rise of gradual abolition, that people of African descent are in an economically challenged position. So the idea that they could afford to go to these schools is pretty limited. But there is often, interestingly, the same people who are involved in various debates over education for white men are also pushing for some education for free blacks. So in New York, you get the New York Manumission Society, founded in 1785 to bring about the end of slavery in New York. 2 years later, they found a school, the New York African Free School. I've got a section of the book where I talk a little bit about the African Free School. There's been a lot of good work on it by historians like Paul Polgar and Sarah Groningseder. But the gist is that what they're getting is much less than what's being offered in academies, which wouldn't surprise us, right? What the most elite white boys are getting versus what free black students are getting. But what's important to note in making that comparison is that the idea of the free school is to prove that to white people that with the proper kind of environmental changes, that is giving people education, that African Americans can be trained up for citizenship. But by kind of constraining the kind of higher levels of what they can get out of that school, they're also kind of limiting the position that those African American children can kind of claim, and African Americans in New York and other states can kind of claim. So when schooling is offered to African American children, especially earlier on, it is very much not with the idea of overthrowing in any way the kind of the social order. It's put forth by people who think that that Americans need to find a way to incorporate African Americans into Northern society. That being said, in this early period, it's part of a kind of hierarchy that all education is sort of seeking to create this sort of gradations among people. By the 1830s and so forth, when common schools become something that you assume white children are going to have access to, then it becomes a question of inclusion and exclusion. And like, that's when things become much more, violent at times, but much more contested, right? It's actually less of a threat earlier on when not everybody has access to schools, that some of the kind of most privileged kids of African descent get an education. It becomes much more of a problem for Northern whites as time goes on, and more of their identity is bound up in the privileges afforded them in part by virtue of being educated. And so I guess, should I punt on the South regional question? But yeah, you're right. There's pretty much
punting. We go for it on fourth down here. No punting.
Right. Yeah. Michael's a college football fanatic. In any event, so in the South, right, academies are actually this is one of the findings in the book that I think some people in the weeds of education scholarship kind of thought was interesting, but academies are often thought of as a New England idea. Some of the famous ones are Phillips Exeter, Phillips Andover, schools that still exist, but really per capita per free population, at least. They're pretty much more prevalent in the South. And that's because, right, for the children of the planter class, this is great, right? You can siphon off public funds to subsidize the education for the planter elite without having to do anything, pretty much, for ordinary Southern whites, who then will remain in ignorance and not question our, overriding authority. That works for them, and at the same time, they're not particularly inclined to invest in education for enslaved people. That prohibition, also in kind of tandem with what happens in the North, grows much stronger, and is much more heavily policed by the second third of the 19th century.
Thank you, Mark. And I was really curious to hear more about the South and in your book, and I think as most historians define it, that's the Chesapeake, the Carolinas, and Georgia. And it kind of leads me to, I guess, the third question I have, but it was something that kind of loomed in my mind as I read your book. And it's this. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the failed plans for public education, especially in the 1770s and the 1780s? And I think when you mentioned it briefly, and you discuss it in your book a little bit, the most famous one, because he's the most famous individual, is Thomas Jefferson's failed 1779 plan to promote a pyramidal scheme of public education, which would have filtered all the way up to the College of William and Mary, if I remember correctly, under his schema. So I suppose this question isn't just limited to the South, although I did reference Jefferson. But can you talk a little bit more about why some of the more idealistic plans, and as you say, in the 1780s and 1790s, with people like Melanchthon Smith, maybe some of the more radical plans to fund public schools failed in this time period?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the pyramid that Michael's referring to here is that this idea that you would have a broad base of tax supported public schools at the bottom, and there would then be kind of a middle level of sort of what we would think of as secondary schools, all the way up to a college, and sometimes to in some plans a national university. And the idea was, in Jefferson's pretty crude phrasing, but it was kind of an egalitarian idea at the time. You would rake from the rubbish the best people, right? So the argument that basically, if you believed all men were created equal, and that talented people could be found anywhere, and that the cruelty of the old world was actually that it deprived society of these talented but obscure individuals from being able to shape and better themselves and their society. If that was the cruelty of the old world, then you had to create these mechanisms to find these people and then elevate them. And so in Jefferson's plan, right, you would have everybody go to one of these, every free white person go to these town schools, and then there would be some scholarships for the talented ones in a county to go to the equivalent of an academy, and then so on, and that this would be the way to actually create, right, again, what we would think of as kind of meritocracy. And I think this is sort of how we hope and think about schools nowadays to a certain extent, but it's an expensive endeavor, and one of the things I talk a lot about in the book, is just how the Revolutionary War was very, very destructive. There is a background of academies that were built prior to the revolution, and even those are challenged. I've got a whole section of just like academies that got blown up during the war, and one that was actually just taken apart, and the lumber was used presumably for fortifications somewhere. So like there's just a tremendous amount of rebuilding that needs to happen, and it's hard enough when you've got elite people who were already associated with an academy trying to rebuild one. To raise the funds to do any of these plans is really quite difficult. So Jefferson's plan kind of fails. There's a few others. There's this essay contest hosted by the American Philosophical Society to design a national system of education, and the winners kind of propose similar plans that would be nationwide. That's, again, like a really large proposition. Funding it would be difficult. There are political stakes here. to a certain extent, the more democratic, for lack of a better word, the more a plan was designed to allow this kind of upward mobility, the bigger the government needed to be, which was for various reasons a tough sell, not the least because at the time, certain plans for expanding the ambit of the federal government were actually associated with sort of elite projects. So, for example, in the mid 1790s or the early 1790s, right, the biggest controversies over the expansion of the federal government has to do with the creation of the Bank of the United States, which is essentially an institution that like empowers, in some cases, the merchant class. It's seen as happening at the expense of ordinary people. And so if you view it that way, then the idea, like the worst thing the bank does is creates an elite inadvertently by sort of allowing certain people to kind of use corruption to their advantage. But if you created like a national university, even if you have all these claims for how you're going to make sure it's accessible to people, there's like a pretty legitimate fear on offer that that's actually designed to do what we think the bank might do. And so there's kind of issues about the size of government and where power should be. And then again, I'll return to the point, one of the points I began with, which is just that other people are prioritizing academies, and they think they can do that. They like them for their reasons that they want them, and so long as they are holding the power strings, then they can do what they want, and they do. So yeah, there's the host of reasons. It's one of these kind of, sometimes it's almost impossible to explain why something doesn't happen sometimes. And it's one of those hard things for historians to do, but there's a kind of host of obstacles. And that's to say nothing of religious issues, which are a kind of whole nother story.
No, I did the worst thing a moderator could do, which is lay a counterfactual on you
Right.
and ask you to explain it. But that's my portion of grilling for the evening. I actually have just one more question, and then I want to open it up to comments. And I know there are a few already, but and this is maybe a broader comment, but that's why I saved it for last. And maybe it will inform the questions and the discussion that's had moving forward. I think it's really interesting that elite formation and you could say class formation is the major theme of your book. And I didn't know that you initially wanted to call it monarchical education rather than aristocratic education. And that actually helps me understand some of the points that you're making. But it strikes me that this way of thinking about the moment, the era of American nation building, it seems like, at least through the lens of education, which I agree with you is a lens through which so much of the 18th and early 19th centuries, not to say the 20th century and today, it's such a great lens for us to view all of the problems and maybe promises of the American nation, trying to put that delicately. But it's interesting to me because it seems like through this book, way of thinking about the American Revolution is in a way a top-down way of thinking about it, which is to say that this is a debate, as you know, Mark, and as many of us here know, has been raging for a long time amongst historians about the causes of the American Revolution, or the origins, I should say, and then the results, that it's one elite replacing another. And what I learned most from your book is that there was a conscious effort on the part of certain sectors of elites in North America, the early United States, to refashion themselves, if not as an aristocracy, and it's small a aristocracy, not a legal aristocracy, but as a power elite. Does that accurately reflect your view of the American Revolution, or am I just sort of pushing you into a corner here and making you answer questions you don't want to answer?
Yes and no. Yes and yes. To a certain extent, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that I was thinking about, I think when I started graduate school, was that the notion of there being sort of top-down interpretations of the revolution tended to be kind of laudatory, and bottom-up interpretations tended to be somewhat more cynical. But like this, I started graduate school right after the financial crisis. And so for me, like the problem to explain was to a certain extent, like growing inequality and the sort of power of a certain group of people that made it really hard to fight. So it was hard to fight against, right? And like, Thomas Piketty's book came out while I was doing this, and like, so I was thinking a lot about, right, why a democratic society has this particular problem of like just runaway inequality, and people are like, at least for a long time, we're just sort of letting it happen. And so that's sort of where my head was at, in crude terms. How do we explain this? How do they justify it and make it seem like, sensible? And to me, like, education seemed like the thing. Like, oh no, it's cool, we can have Timothy Geithner be the Secretary of the Treasury after 2008 financial crisis because like he's really smart. And that's not a policy decision. That's a like deference to some notion of like, meritocratic technocracy. And so that's all fizzling around in my head, no doubt, when I was writing and when I was researching the book. But to a certain extent, I think I don't know that I would go that far, that like the revolution just replaces one elite with another, because I think what the revolution does is sets the terms by which that process becomes a point of conflict. And so like, I think one of the criticisms of top-down histories of the American Revolution often is that they're, consensus histories. That is, that there's not a whole lot of stuff to debate. There's not a whole lot of class analysis. There's not a whole lot of conflict analysis. And like, I don't think I'm guilty of that, even if I am intentionally perhaps guilty of taking a top-down approach. And so this is kind of how things are fought through. And also, the final answer to your question is that in a lot of ways, I think you could read this as a response to, in some measure, Gordon Wood's radicalism of the American Revolution. There's a footnote in there that kind of tips my hand on this, but essentially, education is really central to Wood's story of the revolution being not just transformative in creating the kinds of debates I'm talking about, but like, the original subtitle of the book is like how the American Revolution created the most democratic society like imaginable. It is this kind of hyperbolic thing. And one of the things I wanted to show is that, and one of the ways he says this is that, by creating a kind of ideal of education being the source of power, they've kind of opened things up. And one of the things I wanted to show is how they use that very thing to actually kind of close the door, at least, for a time at least. And so that, right, the expansion of democracy doesn't actually necessarily extend to everyone inevitably, because there's got to be all these fights over access to, especially to schools. And so, yeah, I think it's a legitimate critique that it is kind of top down, and there are parts that are just sort of local political histories of different states. But I think that if you read it sympathetically, it's a complicated American Revolution that's full of conflict, that again centers the question of elite power. And I see you smirking because I think you knew that was what I was going to say. But anyway.
No, I'm smirking because that was an elegant answer. And to be fair, I have had the pleasure of reading the book, and I know many of us here haven't yet. And this is a reminder, by the way, purchase your copy. And if you're in New Rochelle, purchase your signed copy, or a copy with a signed bookplate, coming soon to New Rochelle. The reason I'm smirking is because I really did read it as a rejoinder, and I think an appropriate rejoinder to Gordon Wood. And I think that I think what's most important about your book is that you show that the debates and the politics behind allocation of resources as it pertains to education was always contested. And I think that's the most important thing that I learned from the book. But nobody wants to hear from me anymore. So we have some questions from the audience. We have two lengthy ones, and I'm going to start with Barbara Crane. It's a fantastic question. And if I may, Barbara, I'm going to just sort of restate it because I think it's something that Mark has a lot to say about, or a lot to talk about. And it's about the role of religious instruction in schools. The difference, first of all, I would, Barbara, if you don't mind, sort of just say that having read the book, ask Mark, I should say, to sort of talk about the role of religion behind the founding of these academies, especially before the American Revolution, how that role changed in terms of denominations and the power in political power that these denominations held in particular localities, particular regions, particular states. And then Barbara also asks, and Mark, if you could address this as well, was religion taught? If so, to what degree and to what end? And when did it become the norm that teaching religion or religious instruction in public schools in general became something that we don't associate with American education, or at least American public education?
Yeah, these are great questions. So thank you, Judith. So I start the book, deep in the 18th century, like 1730s or so, in sort of the mid-Atlantic regions, where academies first kind of start popping up, largely to train ministers. The problem of the mid-Atlantic is massive migration, population growth, and not commensurate amounts of ministers coming to their aid. And right, these are very religious people. They need a ministry, and the ministry is supposed to be educated. And so they get frustrated waiting for people who maybe understandably don't want to leave, Glasgow or Oxford to come to, central Pennsylvania. And so they start building these academies to train their own ministers, like locally. So there's the early movement for academies tends to be coming out of denominational effort and denominational energy. And those schools sort of take on a secular-ish bent, for lack of a better phrase. But in other words, not everybody who goes to an academy that is founded by the Presbyterian Church in the 1750s actually becomes a Presbyterian minister. They often become lawyers or merchants, or they serve in the Continental Army and then figure it out afterwards, that they're using these schools as kind of springboards for something else. So even when academies are very clearly designed to train ministers and to sort of be bastions of a denomination, the effects are always broader than that. Students use the schools for what they're going to use them for. And then after the revolution is when the contestation over the sort of function of academies and what they're going to be sort of what efforts they're going to be directed toward becomes important thing to fight about. And part of it is practicality. The denominations are rebuilding churches. They're spread thin. Denominations had long relied on transatlantic support. They're not, the Presbyterian Church in the UK is no longer going to, help subsidize churches in North America. And so the churches are spread thin and maybe aren't devoting as much time and energy to building schools. Meanwhile, there's a movement, a desire among the parents of a kind of rising American political elite to want something like an academy for their kids. And so they're sort of channeling new forces to create those schools and to direct them to different ends. And so the 1780s is a kind of period when both religious figures and other kinds of associations, right? Denominations on the one hand, but also like Masonic lodges on the other are working to sort of build academies and direct them to their own purposes. And slowly but surely, the kind of denominational hold on academies fades. In part, it's unsustainable to have in every mid-Atlantic community that wants an academy to have 4 of them. And so the way to sustain them is for the schools to say, we won't offer any particular religious denominational instruction in the schools. We'll make available access to, a Presbyterian and a Methodist and Episcopalian church in town. And in fact, some of the early ones in New York are founded explicitly around this idea that 3 ministers will join together with some local luminaries to build an academy that can then serve kind of everybody. And there's that. So the second part of your question about how this plays out in common schools, the common school model is, especially by the 1830s, thoroughly Protestant, right? Most things in the United States were, but that becomes a bigger problem as the Catholic immigration surges in the 30s and 40s and beyond. And so the idea of the schools being even non-denominationally Protestant becomes a problem. This is sort of where you get parochial education coming out of. That's a long fight to sort of de-Protestantize the common schools. And to take religion out of the common schools is a story that gets us into the, to now, but certainly to the 20th century. I think that sort of gives you a gist of the long arc. But I think the idea that common schools are Protestant institutions becomes more overt once it becomes a problem, and that's once there's enough Catholics for it to be a problem.
Thank you, Mark. I want to get to Sean Griffin's fascinating question that'll take time, I think, to answer. But I just have a follow-up before we get to Sean's question. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, and so did Barbara's question, common schools. And can you just clarify for us a little bit? I personally, as not an expert on education, just tend to associate. And I know there's some, by the way, some New England historians here as well. I tend to associate common schools with New England and the town-based model. And you talk a little bit about it in your book, but can you just explain a little bit to us about the way in which the common school model that people like me, and I think, non-historians, but people who are just interested in the past, sort of associate reflexively with New England, how that changed in response to the rise of the academies, which in my reading in your book really proliferated in, as you said, the South, but also the Mid-Atlantic, and maybe the way that New Englanders' minds changed about common education?
Yeah, this is a great question. This was sort of one of the things to figure out. So the background here is that many New England towns already had something that you could turn into what I've been calling a common school, and that is their town schools that had been around since the 17th century to teach young kids, the basics, and mostly so they could be kind of good, Puritan kids and read the Bible and so on. And what happens following the revolution, I think, is that that's still there. There's still this base on which you can build in New England. It makes the threat of academies all the more acute because it's actually, in some sense, a regression in the minds of some people that, by creating these academies, which, again, their main reason for existing is to offer something more advanced than common schools. But what's important to note is that for certain wealthy parents, they chose to send their kids to the academy just to get a basic education, right? So instead of sending those kids to learn the 3 R's at the town school in where they existed in Massachusetts or Connecticut, but especially Massachusetts, actually New Hampshire too, in the 1780s, they're now sending them to the academy for that, 7-year-olds to go learn how to read. And so what that means is they're no longer invested morally, energetically, fiscally, so on, in the town schools that had long just been there to serve everybody. And so in New England, it's an acute threat in certain ways to the old thing. And therefore, instead of building upon it, right, they have this infrastructure in place that they're not building upon it. They're actually, all this additional resources are going to academies. And so there is in New England a kind of contest to reinvest all this time, energy, and money that were going towards academies back into the common schools. And so you see similar flurries of bills in Vermont, in New Hampshire, in Massachusetts, Connecticut, in the 1790s and the 1800s to funnel tax dollars at the state level back to the local communities to build the town schools so that this kind of retrogression is not actually catastrophic and sort of as a reinvest. So so I think that gets at it, but that's a really, really important point and a really good question.
Thank you, Mark. And as everything, and you described this in the book, that the contest over public education versus academy AKA, I suppose, private education. New England is also politicized as well. And, all right, I'm gonna attempt, Sean Griffin, to compress your question, which is a fantastic question, and I think returns to one of the questions that I had about your book for you, Mark. But it's a question that returns to the theme of class and the ways in which that intersected with education, both theoretically and in practice. But this about the 1820s and 1830s, Mark, so this gets to sort of the epilogue of your book, the last chapter in the epilogue of your book. But Sean asks about the relationship between the earliest labor organizations, especially in New York City and Philadelphia, but elsewhere as well, that began to rise in the 1820s and 1830s, and these were the so-called working men's parties. And Sean brings up a fascinating point and a really good question, that one of the demands among many that the early working men's parties had as the earliest labor organizations in the United States was demands for common education, public education for working class children. And Sean asks, what failed to happen in New York, for example, between the passage of Peck's Bill, which you described at the end of your talk, Mark, in 1812, in the 1820s and 30s? What failed to happen that prevented many children of the working classes? And I might just add, and Mark, this is a question for you to answer, whether or not that cuts across religious boundaries, Protestant and or Catholic, from obtaining an education. How did some of your earlier figures chronologically prefigure or pave the way, or did they not, for people like Horace Mann, who famously in the 1840s pioneered public education in New York State?
Yeah, this is a great question. Sean, thanks for coming and for throwing this out there. So there's two things that happened in the 1830s. I'm going to try and do this without getting too into the weeds here, but there's this call among working people for equal education, right? And it's part of these kind of like utopian egalitarian ideals on the one hand, but the normal conventional story of what happens in terms of public education in that same period is that it's these kind of, elite capitalist Whigs, people like Horace Mann in Massachusetts and Henry Barnard in Connecticut, who are like responsible for the further systematization of public schooling. And so, right, you've got this, it seems to be demands are coming from both ways. And so there's like a cynical version of the story where the sort of like elite capitalist class has hoodwinked ordinary people, and they are imposing public schools on them so they can kind of control them and make them good, docile workers. Then there's this other thing that like, no, schooling is still this radical tradition, part of this radical movement, and these calls are in the face of this kind of Whig entrepreneurial elite. Okay, so that's like the backdrop. What I think's happening, and so what I try to do in the last chapter, and this is the part of the book I'm not convinced by, is to say that the more radical tradition of those earlier people I'm talking about, like the Pecks of the world, just make common cause at a certain point with the Whig reformers who are interested in bureaucratization and bureaucratic centralization, because they recognized on the one hand the Pecks of the world, that you need some higher education to train teachers in particular to make possible the expansion of common schools. And the Whig reformer types realize at some level that for this idea of for anybody to take seriously the idea that there is a meritocracy, you actually do need to provide that basic level of education, or people will rightly call you on not actually doing anything to create equality of opportunity. And so whatever elite you produce is clearly not some talented group, but just the fortunate few. And so they realize that both sides realize they need the other. And so the kind of common school group of the 1810s makes common cause with the eventual Whig reformers, right? And the kind of more elite group from the backdrop. To get their common schools, they concede on the meritocracy front. To get the meritocracy thing, the Whig types concede on the common school front and in fact expand it. Where do the workies fit into this? Well, I think part of the problem and part of the the reason that these two stories have existed in the historiography simultaneously is that the workies are in the cities. And this model essentially works in the North in the rural areas. The idea that essentially what most of these states do to create common schools is they raise some tax support in the form of a school fund, and they funnel some of that money into local districts, but those local districts have to join together to build the school and to raise some tax revenue themselves, among themselves. And that works really well in the kind of town village structure of the rural North. It's more complicated in growing cities. Those are a really different environment. In the same way, it's more complicated in the South, where you've got a county system where people don't join together. There isn't this kind of tradition of social capital formation in local communities. And so I think what the workies' demands are born to a certain extent of the failure of this to keep up in the cities, and also that in the cities there persists a kind of bifurcation between what I've been calling common schools, but that are schools that are meant to serve most kids, and also poor schools, which is this sort of older tradition of putting, sort of like often connected to almshouses, but like essentially charity schools that differentiate the children of paupers from the children of producers. And so there's more divisions to overcome in the cities. But again, I'm not totally convinced myself on this point. I mean, there's another argument to be made that that maybe the workies are also remain hostile to the idea of some of the more that the need for there to be kind of people who know Latin at all, as where they won't even maybe concede that point. But I don't know. This is I think an open problem. So it's a really good question. But I hope that kind of distills some of the potential moving parts that are at play in your question.
Thank you, Mark. We have about 10 minutes, and the Q&A is open, as are the chat. And you're also welcome to raise your hand through the raise your hand function, and I can unmute you. But while we wait for people to formulate questions, Mark, I actually have a question for you, and I think it relates to Sean's question. I think it relates to your answer as well. And I have the pleasure, as I've shown earlier, of having your book in front of me. Yet another plug to buy.
You're doing the work for me, because I'm not going to remember that.
Well, it's that good. It's that good. But it's a question that I think builds off of your answer, Sean's question, as I said, and then your answer. And broadly stated, it's a question about anti-intellectualism. And I think that, none of us here need to be told that that's a cultural and political movement that exists currently in the United States under the imprimatur of a current president. But I isolated this quotation, and it's for, if you get the book and you have a chance to mark it up like I have, it's from page 150. It's a quotation from Dr. Benjamin Rush, who himself we could say is an elitist, and also a quotation from Noah Webster, who you began your presentation with. And it's a rejoinder by at least an educational elitist against other educational elitists. And I'll just read the quotation. This is from Dr. Benjamin Rush. The common people, and we like the word common here at the ITPS for obvious reasons, do not despise scholars because they know more, but because they know less than themselves being common people. And it's an interesting idea, because I think that anti-intellectualism is not just a modern day or 21st century issue to contend with. It's been an issue for quite a long time, and the famed historian Richard Hofstadter wrote a book called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And so this is a little bit of a broad question, if you don't mind, Mark, but in the context of your work, and this is sort of gesturing to today, right? How do you see anti-intellectualism from the 18th and 19th centuries informing what's happening now?
I think they were more nuanced than we are. You know, I am kind of persuaded by the point that, like, if you know Latin, that isn't a good reason for you to be my senator. Like you know, I think there's a certain basic level of like capacity one needs to have to hold certain public offices, but you know, the point that I think they were making that gets lost sometimes in the more modern maybe version of this is that, like, there should be a correspondence between what an elected official needs to be able to do and what we expect them to know. So the point they're making is like, it's fine if people learn Latin. Don't bash the eggheads. It just doesn't mean that they should be your mayor. And that's, you know, right. That makes some sense to me. And that's not often how it's done these days. Nowadays, it's sort of like the very notion that you know anything is itself like is a problem. And I also think that it wasn't anti-expertise in certain ways. There's this discussion of like, well, make it its own profession, right? Which is, you know, kind of what we're doing right now, you know, making specialized knowledge a profession. But what we invest in and what in terms of public education should be the stuff that is also important to the society. So a good example of this is like the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862, which creates public universities through federal funded public universities through land grants. This is the source of most of the big state universities, including the Ohio State University, is that they're going to make seemingly higher education that's normally seen as like antithetical to the people's interests actually serve the people's interests by, for example, I used to live across the street from the Ohio State cornfields, where they would experiment on how to make, you know, agriculture work better for the agricultural population. They would bring those students to Ohio State to both learn, you know, the way it's written is sort of like to the land grant mission without stomping on, you know, liberal education, make available access to these other more kind of useful, in their phrase, to society forms of schooling. So there's a lot of debate about what to invest in. Now, that argument can go the wrong way. That can be used to, that can be like, I could have just argued for STEM instead of the humanities if you, right, do it the wrong way. But they would also say, right, that we're making these points about like the need for agricultural education because we believe education has a civic function, that is, it serves the public weal, and so does history. And so you can't, that arguments in favor of like scientific agricultural education were not arguments against learning American history, which they are often now. And so the needle I try to thread throughout the whole book is that the people who are going after these elite schools that seem disengaged, too far apart from the needs of Americans, not what people want to see, and which they cast in ways that sound kind of like the way sometimes people talk about like the Ivy League nowadays, was done not from a place of ignorance or wanting the country to be ignorant, but actually from a place of wanting to make the country have a more broad-based, be more broadly informed. And I don't think anti-intellectualists these days really have any interest in that. I think what they have an interest in these days is making fun of pointy-headed intellectuals, undercutting public schools, and then bragging that they have a sinecure at Stanford at the Hoover Institution. And, you know, so trading on those institutions that they kind of go after and making sure that their audience is none the wiser. But I'm a cynic.
But you're right, Mark. One last question, and I think this is a good way to end it. And it's another question from Barbara Crane, so thank you, Barbara. And I'm going to, Barbara, if you don't mind, sort of restate the question, tie it into Mark's last answer, and then sort of push it towards wrapping it up. Barbara asks about when property taxes became the source of financing for public education, because her understanding, and this is also my understanding, is that that's a key factor in education inequality. The amount of resources that particular localities have to finance schools through property taxes, and I also think, Mark, that it feeds into sort of what you were just saying near the end of your last comment. It's not necessarily about anti-intellectualism, but it's about the ways in which certain communities privilege education to the extent that they finance it, and how they deny that privilege to other communities that might even be conjoined to them, county to county.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question. But one of my favorite things about teaching this period to students who sometimes come into classes thinking that the American Revolution was this revolt against taxation of all sorts is just to show them how taxed New Englanders in particular were, and New Yorkers increasingly, right? When they did property taxes. So the short answer to your question is property taxes were an important basis of support from this early period on, but the way they did property taxes was really, really different, and the way communities were organized was really, really different. They would count. It wasn't just the value of your home and the land. It was they were counting cows and windows and all sorts of stuff. If you read a New England tax list, it goes on and on and on. All the different things that they tax. They tax your carriages by how many wheels they have. They're they're doing all sorts of stuff to make sure like you pay your fair share. And so personal property as well as real property, like they're going to get what you owe. And so it is the foundation of opening access in the period that I'm talking about. Without that model in place, it can't happen. And in fact, part of the reason that public education is so hard to come by in the South is that Southern states constitutionally make it difficult to levy value-based property taxes, actually. And so in this period, it's actually a challenge. And so they're sort of like blanket rates, which basically means that they're regressive taxes. But in the period I'm talking about, they're very progressive taxation. It's very progressive taxation. And B, northern rural communities are economically integrated in a way they're just not anymore. And that the irony of ironies is that northern schools are so hard to integrate now for the very reasons they were easy to integrate then, which is to say that back then everything is kind of local. There's going to be a range of wealth and occupation in a single community because it needs to be not self-sustaining, but relatively, there needs to be a lot in one of these in rural societies and what happens over time. And so they're narrowly bounded. It means that kids of different classes are going to school together. There are some towns that are a little bit wealthier than others, but generally you've got richer kids and poorer kids in the same town. What happens over time is, of course, economic segregation as you can move around more. And so what ends up happening is that over time, the very local town districts continue to persist, but those districts become more homogeneous economically, and therefore the property tax base drops out in the communities that the wealthier people leave and shoots through the roof in the communities that wealthier people move into. And so in New York State, this happens over a really long time, but by the early 20th century, what this means is, especially in Westchester, it starts to become strategic. You don't have to draw new district lines. You just make sure that your district is the one where there's only people of a certain class. Then you can funnel all your money to yourself. And then essentially, and this is a sort of point I end the book with, like, a lot of Westchester public schools are not really public schools by the standards of the people who created public education in New York State, because the model was assumed economic integration in communities that doesn't exist anymore.
Well, thank you, Mark. And we've officially gone over, and
we should
I think
stop.
that's a good thing, because that means that it was a stimulating talk and a stimulating conversation, and we had stimulating questions, not including mine. But thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, Michael, and everyone.
Thank you, everybody who attended. We appreciate it so much. And just one final plug, not just to buy Aristocratic Education, although you should, but to please think about, if you're especially a New Rochelle local, to think about supporting the Thomas Paine Cottage Museum in Huguenot and New Rochelle Historical Association, just like all local historical associations need our help at this time. So I think we'll sign off there. Thank you so much for listening to us and for your engaging questions. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. So thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michael.